Tonight, the great Optus blackout chaos with 10 million Australians without a phone, hospitals offline, trains cancelled. So how vulnerable are we if China cyber strikes us? Plus, I'll talk to a former Australian diplomat, a global warming activist who seems determined to starve himself to death in front of Parliament if the government does not ban coal exports.
Until those demands are met, I'll be here every day at Parliament House and I won't eat anything.
I'll ask him if we really should be giving in to blackmail like that. Meanwhile, the ABC falls for a new report that yet again claims the Great Barrier Reef is in danger.
That means very little time for corals to recover.
I will, in fact, check that report because aren't you sick of the scares as well? And Pauline Hanson today gagged in the Senate after false claims that she racially abused a Greens senator who had to be revived with hugs. Isn't it great to see politicians deal with the big problems that you face? Plenty more too tonight. Matt Canavan, Amy Horowitz and others. But first, do you remember that credit card ad, American Express, don't leave home without it? Well, I just wish Anthony Albanese would leave his at home, the credit card that taxpayers gave him. This Prime Minister's gone straight from his visit to China, where he talked about pandas and red wine with the President, got absolutely nothing back in return. He's gone from there straight to the Cook Islands in the Pacific, his 19th foreign trip now in just 18 months. Now, he's going there for the Pacific Island Forum, which New Zealand's Prime Minister has been wise enough to dodge. And the problem with Albanese going with his credit card is that these Pacific leaders see a sucker coming into their casino. Or rather, they see the chief moneybags of a new cargo cult of the Pacific, global warming. Now, of course, it makes sense of them for them to exploit our global warming guilt. I mean, you take the Cook Islands. I mean, if your big exports are things like coconuts and papaya, you're in trouble and you'd be desperate for some free money from the West if it was on offer. And there sure is, because there's nothing like guilting the West into coughing up cash, with stunts like this from Tuvalu claiming that, our island is sinking under the rising seas thanks to the West's emissions, when the science actually shows, as recently as a 2021 study, your island's growing instead. And so, by the way, 42% of atoll islands, another 42% stable. What's more, our Bureau of Meteorology says we're also getting fewer cyclones in our part of the world, including fewer severe ones, the bit in red on this graphic, so don't be scared that the islands are getting blown away either. So I've got to ask, what climate crisis we're trying to fix here? But along comes Albanese, coming spinner with your credit card saying, ignore the science, Tuvalu is in trouble.
We know that Tuvalu is on the front line of climate change.
Honestly, the Tuvalu Prime Minister must have thought, you beauty, got myself a good one here. Especially since Albanese had already made clear, of course, it was going to this meeting to discuss important issues affecting the region, he said, including climate change and regional security, by which he means China. Even worse, Albanese last month said he wanted these Pacific nations to back our bid to host the world's biggest climate summit in 2026. Now, why on earth we want to do that, I do not know. It's just going to give us nothing but grief and more bills. And to get their support for this ridiculous aim, he's promising to give millions to the United Nations Green Climate Fund. That's more free money for the Pacific. Now, really, it is that cynical. It really is. I mean, just how many millions of dollars of your money that Albanese is going to hand over, he hasn't yet said, but you might be able to guess by the size of the tips he's been putting on his credit card whenever he goes travelling like this. I mean, just in June, $100 million for global warming schemes in Vietnam. And that was backed in July by another $50 million to Indonesia for global warming schemes there too. And what will leave the Cook Islands, I hate to think. His global warming obsession, your money. And if Albanese just stayed at home with his credit card, don't you just think we'd all be a little bit better off? But to this massive outage at Optus today, disruptions for 11 hours, total chaos, mobile phones knocked out, customers' internet knocked out, biggest single such outage in our history. The disruption was extraordinary. Some hospitals couldn't take phone calls. Trains to Victoria stopped for an hour, were delayed for hours afterwards. Businesses relying on Optus, they couldn't process payments. And customers using it couldn't pay on their phones. And the uncertainty was made worse by Optus's appalling failure to get out fast and often with updates. I mean, the boss of Optus gave only 2 radio interviews I could count, and that was hours after the outage had started.
Why were you missing in action this morning?
Actually, we've had messages out from the beginning. We have messages on our website.
Yeah, but people have got no internet, so they can't access the information.
Yeah, and that is why we've been focused on restoring the services. I've also done a number of interviews. We are available. Unfortunately, we understand that no message is great for our customers who are not connected.
I think Optus needs to make sure they step up and communicate with people.
Now, what caused this disaster, Optus hasn't yet said, but the fact that it started around 4 a.m, when you might normally do a software upgrade of a system at a time of least impact to customers, suggests this was an upgrade gone horribly wrong. So many questions. So let's ask an expert, Professor Nigel Fair of Monash University, a technologist, a cybersecurity specialist, and also a former very senior police officer. Professor Nigel Fair, thank you so much for joining us. What do you think caused this outage?
We believe this outage was caused via a network fault, and that's probably likely with perhaps an upgrade of the equipment. Could be software, could be hardware, could even be another vendor involved. But needless to say, it stopped the network from operating.
So incompetence, do you think? Is that all?
I think it's hard to put a finger on how it would have happened. I would have liked to have thought any upgrade before it occurs, you do it in a test environment to make sure everything works properly, and then you put it into the production environment so that you have some assurance that everything is going okay.
Can I just ask, I'm not being a conspiracy theory here, but I'm just wondering, if you were going to mount a cyber attack, right, could you achieve the same sort of result?
Well, you certainly could. Absolutely. The goal of a cyber attack is to degrade the network so that you can't use it. This is exactly the same result.
And what does it prove to you, what happened today, about our vulnerability and preparedness for this kind of thing? You know, with trains not running in Melbourne, hospitals knocked offline, people not being able to dial 000, etc., or make any calls, really.
I think it should be a wake-up call, whether it's individuals, whether it's government, and particularly whether it's business, to do your disaster recovery planning and make sure you have business continuity. You know, the same thing could happen to an organisation with the internet cable being out in the footpath and a backhoe digs through it and cuts it. You don't have access. You should practice that sort of recovery just like you should for something like this today. How are you going to operate? What's the workaround?
Did you see from the response that sort of work and preparedness had been done?
On the whole, no, I didn't. The best I saw was people sitting outside the local public library using their free Wi-Fi.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I was wondering whether too much was being made of this, because while I couldn't make calls on my mobile, OptusNet of course, I still could talk on WhatsApp and Viber, and it wasn't, it wasn't offline in that sense. So I'm just wondering how serious you thought this was.
Well, I think it's serious to the extent where when hospitals can't operate and there's patients' lives at risk, that's serious. But all the way down to people that just can't get to work on time or to school, there's exam weeks on this week. Just a general inconvenience. And I think that's probably what we need to plan for, because telecommunications, it sort of cuts both ways. It's its own sector from a critical infrastructure protection perspective from the Commonwealth Government, yet it's also a horizontal and cuts across banking and finance potentially, and cloud services, lots of other health matters. So it all depends how you consume your internet and in what way. If you're doing it particularly through phone calls and SMSs, today probably wasn't a good day for you.
Now, I asked before, you said you could get the same effect with a cyber attack on OptusNet or other carriers. And I'm just wondering, this could actually happen not just at OptusNet, it could happen at Vodafone, it could be a mass attack, like we saw Israel turn the internet in Gaza off at a time of war. This actually could be done to us, couldn't it? And if this is a taste of it with just one carrier knocked off, my goodness, we could be extremely vulnerable to a really concerted attack.
Well, we certainly could be. I have some degree of confidence both through our Commonwealth government entities, particularly the Signals Directorate and the Australian Cyber Security Centre. We've got some brilliant people that are monitoring the internet feeds as it comes in and out of the country to pick up these sorts of things. Our big carriers, particularly Optus and Telstra, have got amazing cyber security preparedness themselves. So I have a degree of confidence for Australians and business and government that won't happen. Similar with the banks, they invest hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into cyber security protections. We can never say never, but I have a degree of comfort that it won't happen.
And finally, is there anything that the government should do or state governments should do to make us less vulnerable? Our systems, we can't have trains knocked out for an hour or more. We can't have hospitals unable to receive calls. Is there something more we can do?
I don't think there's much government can do. Most of our critical infrastructure is either owned and or operated by the private sector. There's a Cyber and Critical Infrastructure Centre as part of the Commonwealth Government Department of Home Affairs. They actively work with the owners and operators of critical infrastructure, each of the 13 nominated sectors. So I'd like to think that they've been busy today and will be continuing to be busy talking to each of these sectors saying, well, this is a great use case scenario. How did you come out of it? And then start doing some probably deeper and more enhanced continuity exercises and probably just thinking about the what ifs and how you respond to them from a tabletop perspective.
I tell you what, we've got to wake up to do all that work now. Absolutely. Professor Nigel Fair, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.
We've got a cost of living crisis. We've got an economy that's struggling. We've got plenty of things for our politicians to fix. But for half an hour today, our Senate was hijacked by the Greens to complain about Pauline Hanson. Pauline Hanson, the One Nation leader, on a Monday said to Green Senator Mehreen Faruqi, and I quote, "If you don't see yourself as loving this country and abiding by the rules of the country, I have no problem. I will actually take you to the airport and put you on a plane." Senator Faruqi, who is a Muslim originally from Pakistan, today said this was racist, and her fellow Greens agreed.
Which is a racial slur.
And we've just seen an incredibly divisive and racially charged referendum, and people's hearts are broken. Let us now please recommit to holding that standard of not permitting racially divisive speech, religious discrimination in this chamber.
I mean, seriously, what Hanson said might be rude, but racist and religious discrimination? She didn't mention either religion or race. But Faruqi was apparently so upset she needed hugs in Parliament, and the President of the Senate, from Labor's left, went off to consider what to do to this Hanson, who, in the meantime, had a right to speak in the Senate taken from her for refusing to apologise. Listen to just some of this pathetic to-do.
And I simply ask you to withdraw without making any further comment.
I believe I'm speaking on behalf of millions of Australians, and
Senator Hanson,
I won't.
Senator Hanson, please, that is a very serious matter. You have breached the standing orders. I'm asking you to take a few moments and reflect on what I've asked you, in fact what I've directed you to do, and that is to withdraw that personal reflection.
What a farce. And I should add some important context. Faruqi was already suing Hansen for $150,000 for telling her earlier she could go back to Pakistan after Faruqi, so fragile, herself tweeted the Queen on her death, "I cannot mourn the leader of a racist empire built on stolen lives, land and wealth of colonised peoples." And I don't think Hansen was the only Australian wondering why, if this is such a terrible land, racist and stolen, that Faruqi did come to Australia. There's nothing racist about wondering about that. Joining me, as on every Wednesday, is National Senator Matt Canavan, the former Resources Minister. Should be, he should be in the front bench of the party. I don't understand what's going on with the opposition there. Matt Canavan, what did you make of this farcical use of Senate time today?
Well, as you said, Andrew, it was half an hour of your nation's parliament took up, and I just sat there thinking, how are we the victims right now? I don't think your nation's politicians are victimised. I don't think we should present ourselves as the victims while many Australians have to work 2 jobs to keep their head above water. Some Australians having to live out of a tent because there's not enough homes. We should be devoting the Senate's time to talking about, using the question time that this hijacked to ask about these issues to make people's lives better. Instead, this week in the Senate, it's the second time the Greens have hijacked the Senate's time. The other day they walked out. That was a bit easier because it went pretty well once they walked out of the Senate. But this time they just wasted our nation's time. The second thing I'd say here, Andrew, is Senator Faruqi does have a form here. You put up one of her tweets. Another tweet she made a few years ago was to tell our nation's Prime Minister, Scott Morrison at the time, and I won't spell it all out, but to F off on Twitter. My view is if you're going to engage in that kind of vulgar language to elected officials, well, you shouldn't be too shocked when some of it might boomerang on yourself, so to speak. If you're going to dish it out like Senator Faruqi likes to do from time to time, you got to be able to take it. That's, to me, the basic rules here. So, it's a pretty robust chamber from time to time, and we should just get on with business.
But shouldn't we ask, I'm looking at that graphic you put out, that tweet of Faruqi's. If she tells Scott Morrison to F off, is she being racist and religiously discriminatory? Or doesn't it work that way? It only works. Well,
this is the problem with identity politics. You read whatever you want. You read whatever you want. Doesn't matter what you say. It matters about what the listener wants you, believes that you have said. And if we're going to establish these kinds of rules, we'll never have a proper society or communication. We just need to move on and get back to business. And I hope tomorrow we have a Greens stunt-free day in the Parliament. Let's all pray for that.
It just goes to show how easily the Greens use the words racist in particular and religious discrimination without any merit, just to shut someone down and smear them. To something, let us get on with the business of the nation. Murray Watt, Agriculture Minister in this Albanese government, today said farmers must do more to cut their emissions to save the planet. Here he is.
I'm always at pains to recognise the enormous efforts the agriculture sector has made already in reducing our national emissions, but the reality is we're going to need to do more. Our international markets and domestic consumers are expecting more and more sustainably produced food.
Matt Canavan, is the Minister right that farmers must now play their part in cutting emissions, and not just by carbon offsets? He said they've got to do things like cutting down cattle burps of methane.
Well, let's be very clear. If the government makes farmers do this, it will mean that you pay more for food in the shops. That's what it will mean. If we produce less food, if we engage or force higher costs on our farmers to produce that food, it will mean higher costs for everybody else. And then you have to wonder, well, why am I paying this higher cost? What's it going to deliver? Well, of course, if we got rid of all Australian farming, it's not going to make a jot of difference. Australia accounts for just 1% of the world's emissions, and our farmers account for about 15% of that 1%. And no other country, no other major country in the world is doing this to their nation's farmers. So why would our government be on the warpath against our farmers? It doesn't make any sense or add up here. And look, I think the other important thing here is hopefully this is finally a big news flash to the National Farmers Federation, who have been walking hand in hand with their enemies in the Greens down this path, thinking somehow that they're going to get rivers of gold from selling carbon offsets or what have you. The reality is that's not the case because, as I say, under the carbon accounting rules, and I don't make these rules, I think they're absurd, but under the carbon accounting rules, farmers account for 15% of our nation's emissions. And they can't offset things twice. They can't grow trees on their farm, sell that to an aluminium smelter, and then also use those same trees to offset the methane coming from their own cattle. If the government enforces this, they won't have that plantation to sell, and as I say, the rest of us will be left with higher priced food and less food available for our whole country.
Matt Canavan, I'm actually out of time. If I could get a 5-second Matt Canavan zinger. Our Defence Forces worked for 6 months to fix one problem, renaming our fleet of drones from unmanned aircraft systems to the gender-neutral uncrewed aircraft systems. To be more woke or not to upset the Chinese when we're firing at them, I don't know. Don't you think that's a weird priority?
Well, lucky our Defence Department, of course, manages every major procurement so well, Andrew, that they've got lots of time to devote these other things. I mean, I'd be concerned about it if we couldn't, say, deliver a sub or couldn't deliver a ship on time and on budget. But they're doing such a bang-up job. They've got so much time to devote to this. Don't you love your taxes at work?
Oh, and they're supposedly in the killing business, but they're, we might have the wrong word for a drone. I mean, seriously, Matt Canavan, thank you so much for your time. After the break, a climate alarmist, the former ambassador, who says he won't eat again unless the government stops coal exports. Wow, okay. I see a tragedy coming up here. And fact-checking yet another report claiming the Great Barrier Reef is in danger from global warming. I mean, don't these people have any shame? Gregory Andrews is a former Australian ambassador to no fewer than 9 African countries. He held senior jobs at the Department of Foreign Affairs in Canberra as well. Is now going on a hunger strike in front of Parliament House. He's a climate alarmist who says he won't eat until the government stops our massive coal and gas exports and more.
Stop coal and gas exports. Stop fossil fuel subsidies. Stop chopping down our native forests. Until those demands are met, I'll be here every day at Parliament House and I won't eat anything.
He now joins me on day 7 of going without food. Gregory Andrews, you must be very hungry by now.
G'day, Andrew. Actually, believe it or not, I'm not hungry. I've never done this before, but after about 3 days, pretty much my gastrointestinal system shut down and I went into starvation mode. So I'm not hungry at all. I'm out the front of Parliament House every day, as you said. The Australian government provides $11 billion a year of fossil fuel subsidies to big companies. That could fund 140,000 teachers or nurses positions or build 22 world-class hospitals. They spend more on fossil fuel subsidies than they do on the army, but climate change is a huge risk to our national security, and they're basically ruining our national security by risking climate change. Sorry, I can't hear you that well. The volume is very good.
We're spending on global warming schemes. I tell you what, you'd spend 10 times more on the poor. But listen, I want to ask. I mean, the subsidies, of course, I won't go down there because you're talking actually about fuel rebates for offshore use of vehicles mainly. So that's not quite fair. But anyway, my point is this: is it fair or mature to stage this hostage drama featuring yourself, where you say, "Do as I say, or I'll kill myself"?
Andrew, by the end of this century, when my children are alive, 3 to 6 billion people won't have a safe place to live on Earth if the emissions keep growing like they are. And the Albanese government isn't listening. You know, I wrote letters to Anthony Albanese and he hasn't even responded.
I just want to get back to my central question, please, Because we've all got to, we could have a long argument about this. You've got the Greens Party in Parliament saying what you're saying. They're going through the democratic process.
Yeah.
The
Let me
democratic
answer your
process,
question then.
if people don't want what they like, they don't have to vote for them if they do.
Yeah.
The question is,
let me answer it.
Do you think it's fair to say, do what I do, I say, or I'll kill myself?
Yeah, yes, I do, because the only person that will suffer is me, and my 83-year-old mother is fully behind me. My wife and my children are fully behind me. And the government needs to wake up to the reality that it's not doing enough. Andrew, I know many listeners and 60% of Australians didn't support The Voice, and I respect that. I respect the decisions Australia made. But I respected Anthony Albanese for having the bravery and courage to push that, even though he knew he'd probably lose it. But he also made a commitment to the Australian people to get climate change under control. And I want to see the same bravery and the same commitment from our Prime Minister.
Right.
I want him to keep his promises.
Well, on that point, the government cannot possibly end coal and gas exports, and certainly not in the couple of weeks you've got to live if you're not going to eat until they do. Andrew,
if you have a look at what
it would devastate the federal budget. Just let me ask the question.
Andrew, if you don't mind just being a bit fair to me, I've been on a hunger strike for... No, I am trying to answer your question, but you keep interrupting me, and I'd like you to show me some respect. I've starved myself for 7 weeks.
You're interrupting
and
me.
You're bullying me.
We'll have to mute your answers
you're
unless you let me ask the question. No, I'm not bullying you. I'm asking a question. I haven't asked it yet.
Rude.
Until I ask it, you haven't got a question.
Actually, at the moment, you're shouting at me.
They cannot do what you want. It would devastate the economy. It would devastate the federal budget, and a lot of Australians would suffer. And it cannot happen in the 2 weeks you've got to live if you stop eating. You'll be dead in a couple of weeks.
Andrew, so let me answer that question now. You've asked me that question twice, and I have not said that the Australian government needs to phase out fossil fuel exports in the next 2 weeks. What I'm saying is we need a hard and real commitment from the Albanese government to break free from Australia's fossil fuel addiction. And I'm doing that for my children, and I'm doing it for our country. And because I want my kids to grow up on a safe planet. And let me give you an example. My daughter is at Melrose High, a public school here in Canberra that Katie Gallagher attended. And when Katie Gallagher finished at that school, she had a future. But my daughter doesn't have the future that Katie Gallagher has. And Katie Gallagher sits in the Parliament House behind me, and she approves billions of dollars a year in fossil fuel subsidies that are destroying the future of our children,
that kind of
but destroying Australia's national security. I'm sorry you feel that way, Andrew.
You're freaking your daughter out. You're freaking your daughter out by suggesting to her that she hasn't got a future.
Andrew, you don't know.
Gregory, the science is against you.
My daughter thinks.
Well,
my daughter, you don't know what my daughter thinks. My daughter is with me 110%. You're telling her she hasn't got a future. She wants a future.
Well,
she wants a future, and that's why she backs me for doing this. If you keep going
this way, you've got only 2 weeks left to live with this stupid idea that your daughter hasn't got a future. You're betraying her, and you'll be betraying her double if you keep going with this. But we shall see if you do. We'll come back to you in 2 weeks and see what's happening.
Look, that's great. I really do wish you had better manners. I wish you had better manners because you're rude.
Well, I wish you had more sense, to be honest. I wish you were a better parent. Thank you. Goodbye. And look, people like that, this Gregory Andrews, are convinced the world is doomed by global warming. Their children are doomed. I mean, fancy telling your children that, when your chances of dying from a climate-related disaster have never been lower. Never been lower. People like that are so convinced the world is doomed by global warming, largely because of the irresponsible media reporting we get of climate scares. And I'm going to give you another example. And again today on the ABC.
A new report says the world's oceans are being transformed by climate change, with more underwater heat waves putting pressure on marine life, including the Great Barrier Reef. And
sure enough, up bobbed someone from this Climate Council, It's the Climate Council, Tim Flannery. Remember him? The guy who once said the rains wouldn't fill our dams again, which our previous guest probably believed. It wasn't true. He's up Bob's another guy from the Climate Council with another scare.
We've seen 4 mass bleaching events over the last decade. That means very little time for corals to recover. We've also seen species on the move. And look, this is measured in loss of tourism dollars.
Now, it is true, the ABC did this morning have someone on the show that admitted that parts of the reef were actually recovering, but even that is a vast understatement of the happy truth. Joining me is reef expert and marine physicist Dr. Peter Ridd. Peter, great to see you again. The reef is just recovering. That's all we were told by the ABC. First, tell us how it's actually going after more than 20 years of global warming scientists telling us it was dying, if not dead already.
No, it's been dying for 60 years. It's only the last 25 that it's been the climate change thing. But of course, we've got record high coral in the last 2 years, despite these supposedly devastating 4 hot water bleaching events. And of the 3,000 reefs of the Great Barrier Reef, we haven't lost a single one. So this is a problem with the science. You know, it's not just that the media are misreporting this, but also the Climate Council is putting out this stuff which is purely wrong, and that misguided chap on the steps of Parliament House is responding to that. It's actually the scientists who are responsible for that guy, and if he dies.
Look, it's tragic, you know, a guy killing himself in front of Parliament House and saying his daughter's got no future. I mean, that's just child abuse in my view, and it comes from reports like this. I mean, this new Climate Council report, have you checked it out?
Yes, and it reads like some sort of fire and brimstone sermon from a 17th century vicar. You know, it's just unbelievable how negative it is. There's not a single good thing. For example, it doesn't mention that we've got record high coral. Why would it? It talks about things like that our sandy beaches are going to retreat by 100 metres in the next 80 years, despite there being no significant sign of significant loss. So the problem actually is back to these so-called scientific institutions giving us these very one-sided, quasi-religious documents that you really can't trust, because they don't tell you any of the good news. There must be just 1 or 2 good things about a slightly warming ocean, like the fact that corals will grow much faster, for instance.
So that report, are you serious? That report on the reef, oh my God, the reef, does not mention that coral cover is at near record levels in recorded history.
No, and they never do. And they don't mention things like, if you look at the data, even for the world's reef, there's been no significant reduction in coral in the world's reef in the last 25 years. So there's all this good news that you could report, but they don't mention almost any of that. And so that means that they're just crying wolf. You can't trust any of it. And that's actually a problem, you know, because I actually have to question myself. You read this and say, well, it's clearly one-sided, but actually the oceans are actually quite hot at the moment, and, you know, maybe there is a problem. But if these scientists are so unreliable that they can't give a proper report where it looks at evidence both ways, why can we trust them?
Yeah, but Peter, this is the thing about the global warming scare, right? I haven't denied that the Earth is warming slightly and that man's emissions may be a factor in that. I haven't denied that. There was a pause for a while, I did point that out, but I don't deny that generally it's been warming a little. The thing I challenge is that there are huge catastrophes that come with it. In fact, as you know, we've been having record crops, although the latest weather pattern this year might change that for this year. We've had record crops. We've had fewer cyclones, etc., etc. I mean, I do not see the disaster that's supposed to come with a warning. Do you?
No, certainly not. But yet climate catastrophes do happen every few hundred years. You know, you could have a huge volcanic eruption that really would cause a catastrophe. And we should be, you can't keep crying wolf on climate change, because there are actually real wolves out there that are coming to get you. And one of them is some sort of climate disaster caused by a natural event. And we need to actually get our food production systems ready for such a thing, but we're not, because we're worried about this nice, gentle warming of the climate, which maybe we're partly involved with.
Peter Reid, I got to challenge you for the first time ever. They can't keep crying wolf. Well, I tell you, I can point to 1,000 climate scientists that have been doing that very nicely for a couple of decades and getting lots of grants, and you're wrong. So there, you see, you get a debate here on Sky News. Peter Reid, lovely to talk to you again. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Ron.
I had to laugh this morning, you know. One of the biggest climate alarmists in the world, as you know, is King Charles, right? But now that he's king, he's had to try to keep his opinions to himself, but is gagging at the cork. But as king, when he opens Parliament, he also has to read out what the government has told him it will do. Like, this is my government's going to do this and this. And he has to keep a stiff upper lip. When last night he had to read out what his the government, the Rishi Sunak government, is actually going to do to wind back the global warming agenda. The poor king. Have a look at him.
This bill will support the future licensing of new oil and gas fields, helping the country to transition to net zero by 2050 without adding undue burdens on households.
Stick that up your ermine jacket. Oh, well, very funny. After the break, I'll show you amazing footage from Israeli soldiers who are, as you know, fighting in Gaza. Stuff that not one reporter in Gaza managed to find or dared to report, and that you need to see. I mean, talk about Hamas using human shields, you'll be astonished. Israeli troops have now surrounded Gaza City and are finding what all those reporters there somehow never managed to see or dared to report to you when talking about those terrible Israelis bombing civilian targets. For instance, in a Boy Scout centre, the Israelis have found a whole bank of rocket launchers. What kind of terrorists would do that? They found more rocket launchers at a mosque, and near an amusement park they found an entrance to the 500 kilometres of tunnels Hamas has dug under Gaza for its fighters, tunnels that the civilians cannot use as bomb shelters. Another tunnel entrance was found next to the Sheikh Hamad Hospital, and night vision shows terrorists shooting from the hospital windows. Another Gaza hospitals, of course, are Hamas headquarters. Meanwhile, Israel's defence forces say they have the Hamas leader in Gaza cornered in his tunnel. After returning from Israel, Ami Horowitz, filmmaker and commentator, joins me from New York. Ami Horowitz, thanks for your time. Compare and contrast what you saw in Israel to what the media back home now is saying about this war.
You know, it's incredible to me. I can't tell you how many times I've spoken to members of the media in Israel while I was there, from outlets all over the world. And they're just aghast that I could have the opinion that Israel is not trying to deliberately kill civilians. This is kind of the narrative they've been pushing, and it's just confounding to me on so many levels. First of all, if Israel wanted to kill civilians, Andrew, they'd all be dead, right? There wouldn't be 8,000 or 10,000 dead. There'd be 800,000 or 1 million dead. Israel has the capability to turn Gaza into glass tomorrow, if that was their goal. But if you've got to really look at the numbers. They're dropping thousands and thousands and thousands of bombs in the most densely populated place on planet Earth, where Hamas, the enemy, is using their own people as human shields. And the number of 8,000 people, 10,000 people, as tragic as that is, although only the civilians, obviously the ones that are militants, you know, I'm glad they're all dead. But so we have 4,000 or 5,000 civilians dead. Look, it's all awful, obviously, but one has to marvel how few civilians have been killed relative to the bombardment that they've had. You know, I spent time talking to members of the IDF military who walked me through what their rules of engagement are, how careful they are when it comes to harming civilians, knowing that even doing that will put their own soldiers at risk. I talked to drone operators who are dropping the bombs. I talked to the man who wrote the ethics of the IDF, the ethical guidebook of the IDF. It's incredible the amount of work and effort and risk they take on in order to limit civilian casualties. Yet, the world looks at this and says Israel is trying to deliberately kill civilians. It is unbelievable. It is truly a blood libel.
I notice not one single estimate I have seen that tries from that death toll, and who knows what the true number is because the figures generally come from Hamas, how many of them are actually soldiers or fighters or terrorists. We don't hear that. Apparently you're supposed to believe they're all civilians, and as I heard one reporter say, oh, most of them are children. I don't believe that for a second, but there's no serious attempt to measure it. I mean, it's just incredible. There's one Palestinian American in Congress over there, Army. She's Democrat Rashida Tlaib, who promoted a video with the slogan, "From the river to the sea," which means getting rid of Israel. I mean, Israel doesn't want to get rid of all Gaza, but the Hamas terrorist group sure wants to get rid of all Israel, and so do some supporters, apparently, like this Congresswoman. Republicans and some Democrats are moving to censure her, but she is not apologetic. Here they are.
If this is not worthy of censure, what is? When you can call for the annihilation of a country and its people, if that's not worthy of a censure, what is?
Trying to bully or censor me won't work because this movement for a ceasefire is much bigger than one person.
So, Amy, apparently it's absolutely shocking to censure this woman, but she says it's not shocking to call for the elimination of Israel. Some strange values there. What's the story with this person?
Well, look, I might have actually a slightly different view on this than you would expect I would have, or maybe people listening would expect I would have. Look, she's part of the Hamas caucus for sure. She's a Palestinian American. I don't expect her to be pro-Israel, right? I do expect her to believe the BS that she's being fed, both of the media and I'm sure people that she knows. So I'm not shocked by it. It doesn't. I mean, look, the problem is, and here's the larger issue, is that her side is not interested in peace. As she said with the genocidal quote, "From the river to the sea," they're not interested in a two-state solution. They're not interested in negotiation. One wonders, why would the Palestinians continue to reject over and over again different offers made to them where they would get essentially 100% of the Palestinian territories, right? With a little bit of here and there where there'd be a land swap with Israel itself to the settlements. Why would they continue to reject it? Well, I'll tell you why. Because anybody who spent any time in the Palestinian territories would see that everywhere you go, you see maps of Israel, except it's not Israel, it says Palestine. If you ask any one of these people, including the great honorable Rashida Tlaib, when you say you want a Palestinian state, where exactly do you want that? And she will tell you she doesn't want Ramallah and Jenin and Gaza City. What does she want? Tel Aviv and Haifa and Jerusalem. That's the reality.
Well, I'm afraid our Greens leader here also tweeted a map of Israel and the West Bank with no Israel on it. One colour, red, free Palestine. Hasn't apologised for that. Amy Horowitz, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Always a pleasure.
After the break, the Optus boss picked a bad day for a luxury photo shoot at a mansion. And Albanese's trip to the Pacific, can we afford it? Now, this Optus disaster today, 10 million people affected, communications gone, already as a scapegoat. It's the CEO, Kelly Bayer Roseman. Not only did this happen on her watch, but she hid from any media conference to explain what was going on. So now she's getting picked on for even going ahead today with a luxury photo shoot for the architect of a $15 million mansion. Joining me is the panel, Michael Costa, former New South Wales Labor Treasurer, and Amanda Stoker, former federal Liberal Senator, former Sky News host, now LNP candidate for the Queensland seat of Oodgeroo. Amanda, is it fair to pick on Bayer Roseman for this outage, which Optus, by the way, still isn't explained?
It's hard to say in circumstances where a proper explanation hasn't been offered. But what we know is that millions of customers were inconvenienced. Small businesses around the country were unable to make sales and take bookings. Retailers were unable to accept payments because of the flow-on consequences of that lack of connectivity, and there were inconveniences all round. Without an explanation, it's hard to say whether or not it's their fault, but it's true to say that to be focusing on one's architectural prowess is really not the first order of the day in a situation like this, and it speaks of being tone deaf.
And Michael, really, every executive and politician's got to know, communicate, communicate, communicate.
Look, I don't think the photo shoot's really the issue. The issue is the one you just raised, communication. And this is the second time this particular CEO has been involved in lack of communication. We remember the data breach, when was it, last year, that we couldn't get any information out of it. There's also a broader issue about this, and I think the Department of Telecommunications, and I say this as a free market person, really needs to get involved here in regulating these things a bit tighter. We stress test our banks. I think we need to stress test our telcos. They're all good at doing diversity and everything else that's fashionable, but their core business is running telecommunication services. And they really need to be able to demonstrate to regulators that they've got backup plans. I mean, the fact that something happens is not the issue. The fact that it took 14 hours to resolve is the issue, and the CEO was nowhere to be seen. I think that's the real issue here, and I think the Department of Communications needs to step.
What the hell?
That's correct.
Customers all in the lurch. Amanda, Anthony Albanese's gone from his visit to China, where he got nothing, to a summit in the Pacific where he's actually promising to hand over our money on global warming. This is becoming a bit of an embarrassment for him, isn't it, this big international sojourn?
It is an embarrassment, surely, but the bigger problem here is that Australia has committed to climate policy without really considering the trade-offs necessary in order to achieve this net zero dream. Research we did for ARC in the last week or so revealed that that's going to cost $9 trillion just in relation to the domestic economy. It's 3 times our current GDP, and it's going to cost a further $7.5 trillion once we take account of exports. That's going to leave us with a further bill, because he's handing out money hand over fist in the Pacific. And the worst possible thing here is that not only will Australians be left unable to afford the energy they need to run their homes and businesses, but it will also leave us with a Pacific dominated by China and an Australia dependent upon China because of its over-reliance on wind and solar. This is an affordability and a security disaster.
Michael Costa, what do you make of this trip so far?
Oh, look, I said to you last week, Andrew, I thought he should have stayed at home and dealt with the domestic issues. In relation to the Pacific, I mean, these rent seekers have been around for a long time seeking sort of, guilt money from the developed world. And I also might make the point, Morrison was involved in this as well. This is not the first time or the first Prime Minister that's gone to one of these forums where there's been promises of compensation for global warming. We should see these people as what they are. They are rent seekers. I don't blame them. If they can get money off the developed world, that's good. But why are we going along with it? In relation to the China trip, Andrew, I said last week I thought he should have been at home, and I think that rate rise yesterday just proves that point. He's got some real problems when he gets back because people are focused on cost of living, and all of this stuff is really, 10th order issues.
It does seem that. I just wonder, Amanda, whether his leadership is almost irreparably broken. I know the polls still show the Labor Party just ahead, but still.
Well, there's been a successive rolling list of issues that he has chosen to pursue that do not reflect the lives that Australians are living right now, as everybody struggles with the cost of housing, the cost of electricity, the cost of food, the cost of fuel. I could keep going. He's worried about international relations. He's worried about guilt money for climate change. He's worried about dividing us in the Constitution. I mean, it just speaks to being out of touch. And for a first-term leader to be out of touch is a very unusual and very dangerous thing.
Yes, I think so too. Look, I'm so sorry I left you short this week because We're so glad to have you back, Amanda, on the screen. You'll be a regular with Michael. I love the pairing. Thank you so much to both of you. More time next week. That's it from me. Well, tune in tomorrow because I've got a very special guest, Scott Morrison. I think he should be back on the front bench of the opposition. I'm not sure I'm got lots of company in that, but I think there's a very good reason for that. That's it from me. Coming up next, Chris Kenny.